Hello, and welcome to today's presentation on Mississippi long-term resident abuse and reporting. My name is Elizabeth, and I will be guiding you through today's content. Today's objectives include identifying resident rights against abuse, discussing definitions of abuse, reviewing signs and symptoms of abuse, discussing the abuse reporting process, discussing penalties for abusing and also failure to report abuse, and identifying who to make reports of abuse to. Long-term care resident rights. Residents have the right to be free from verbal, sexual, physical, and mental abuse. Nursing homes can't keep residents apart from everyone else against the resident's will. If a resident feels they have been mistreated, abused, or the nursing home isn't meeting their needs, neglect, report this to the nursing home, family, local long-term care ombudsman, or state survey agency. The nursing home must investigate and report all suspected violations and any injuries of unknown origin within 5 working days of the incident to the proper authorities. Let's now go over some definitions. Abuse: the willful or non-accidental infliction of physical pain, injury, or mental anguish on a vulnerable adult, the unreasonable confinement of a vulnerable adult, or the willful deprivation by a caretaker of services which are necessary to maintain the mental and physical health of a vulnerable adult. Abuse shall not mean conduct which is part of the treatment and care of, and in furtherance of the health and safety of, a patient or resident of a care facility, nor shall it mean a normal caregiving action or appropriate display of affection. Abuse includes but is not limited to a single incident. Exploitation is the illegal or improper use of a vulnerable adult or his resources for another's profit or advantage, with or without the consent of the vulnerable adult, and includes acts committed pursuant to a power of attorney. Exploitation includes but is not limited to a single incident. Neglect: either the inability of a vulnerable adult who is living alone to provide for himself the food, clothing, shelter, health care, or other services which are necessary to maintain his mental and physical health, or failure of a caretaker to supply the vulnerable adult with the food, clothing, shelter, health care, supervision, or other services which a reasonably prudent person would do to maintain the vulnerable adult's mental and physical health. Neglect includes, but is not limited to, a single incident. Signs, symptoms, and actions. Self-neglect: the inability to provide self-care, such as cook, eat, and bathe. Over or under medication. Untreated medical or mental conditions. Aimless wandering, and causing fires. Psychological, emotional abuse includes verbal threats or insults, curing, belittling, withholding companionship, or isolation. Physical abuse: beating, slapping, kicking, causing welts, cuts, burns, abrasions, sprains, bruises, fractures, and broken bones. Neglect by caregiver or others: lack of supervision, failure to give medicine, food, or personal care, and not attending to bed sores. Sexual abuse: sexually transmitted diseases, pregnancy, bruises, bleeding, pain or itching in genital or anal areas, and difficulty in walking or sitting. Financial abuse and exploitation: mismanaging money or stealing of property, savings, and credit cards, unusual activity in bank accounts, and misuse of assets by a representative payee. The process of reporting suspected abuse, neglect, and/or exploitation. First, a report is filed. The receiving agency will conduct an investigation, and there is a determination of the report. At that time, the abusers may enter the judicial system, and services are offered to the victim. During the report-making investigation portion, if circumstances warrant, APS has the right to retain custody of the adult victim. The adult victim also has the right to refuse any services offered by APS. Let's now talk about who makes a report of suspected elder abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Mandated reporters. Mandated reporters are any person who, within the scope of his employment at a care facility or in his professional or personal capacity, has knowledge of or reasonable cause to believe that any patient or resident of a care facility has been the victim of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, shall report immediately the abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Reports from long-term care facilities must be made orally or telephonically within 24 hours of discovery. This excludes Saturdays and Sundays and legal holidays of the State Department of Health and the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit of the Attorney General's Office. Examples of mandated reporters include, but are not limited to, health professionals or mental health professionals, medical examiners, chiropractors, a nurse engaged in admission, social worker, practitioner who relies solely on spiritual means for healing, state, county, or municipal criminal justice employee or law enforcement officer, human rights advocate, long-term care ombudsman or council member, accountant, stockbroker, financial advisor or consultant, financial planner, and any officer or employee of a bank, savings and loan, credit union, or any other financial service provider. In the reporting process, when the report is actually made, certain information will be asked. Typically, the contents of the report will include the date, time, and place of the incident, the name of any individuals believed to have knowledge of the incident, the name of the individuals believed to be responsible for the incident and their connection to the patient or resident, and such other information that may be required by the State Department of Health and/or the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit as requested. Additionally, the following will typically be included: the name, address, telephone number, occupation, and employer's address and telephone number of the person reporting, the name and address of the patient or resident who is believed to be the victim of abuse or exploitation, the details, observations, and beliefs concerning the incident, and any statements relating to incident made by the patient or resident. There are laws in place that protect reporters. What are the rights for reporters? Any individual who, in good faith, makes a report as provided in this section, or who testifies in an official proceeding regarding matters arising out of this section, shall be immune from all criminal and civil liability. The immunity granted shall not apply to any suspect or perpetrator of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of any vulnerable adult, or of any other criminal act under any statute of this state or municipal ordinance defining any act as a crime or misdemeanor. No person shall terminate from employment, demote, reject for promotion, or otherwise sanction, punish, or retaliate against any individual who, in good faith, makes a report as provided in this section, or who testifies in any official proceeding regarding matters arising out of this section. Any care facility that complies in good faith with the requirements of this section to report the abuse or exploitation of a patient or resident in the care facility shall not be sanctioned by the State Department of Health for the occurrence of such abuse or exploitation if the care facility demonstrates that it adequately trained its employees and that the abuse or exploitation was caused by factors beyond the control of the care facility. There are penalties for failing to report abuse, neglect, or exploitation of our elder residents. The consequences of failure to report. A person who fails to make a report as required under this subsection who, because of the circumstances, should have known or suspected beyond a reasonable doubt that a vulnerable adult suffers from exploitation, abuse, neglect, or self-neglect, but who knowingly fails to comply with this section shall, upon conviction, be guilty of a misdemeanor and shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $5,000 or by imprisonment in the county jail for not more than 6 months, or both such fine and imprisonment. A person who intentionally makes a false report under the provisions of this section may be found liable in a civil suit for any actual damages suffered by the person or persons so reported and for any punitive damages set by the court or jury. There are steep costs when dealing with elder abuse, neglect, and/or exploitation. What are the penalties for abuse, neglect, or exploitation of residents? Any person who willfully commits an act or willfully omits the performance of any duty which act or omission contributes to, tends to contribute to, or results in physical pain, injury, mental anguish, unreasonable confinement, or deprivation of services which are necessary to maintain the mental and physical health of a vulnerable adult, or neglect, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and, upon conviction thereof, shall be punished by a fine not to exceed $1,000 or by imprisonment not to exceed 1 year in the county jail, or by both such fine and imprisonment. Any accepted medical procedure performed in the usual scope of practice shall not be a violation of this subsection. Any person who willfully exploits a vulnerable adult, where the value of the exploitation is less than $250, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and, upon conviction thereof, shall be punished by a fine not to exceed $5,000, or by imprisonment not to exceed 1 year in the county jail, or by both such fine and imprisonment, where the value of the exploitation is $250 or more. The person who exploits a vulnerable adult shall be guilty of a felony and, upon conviction thereof, shall be punished by imprisonment in the custody of the Department of Corrections for not more than 10 years. Any person who willfully inflicts physical pain or injury upon a vulnerable adult shall be guilty of felonious abuse or battery, or both, of a vulnerable adult and, upon conviction thereof, may be punished by imprisonment in the state penitentiary for not more than 20 years. Who exactly receives reports of elder abuse, neglect, and exploitation? Abuse reports can be made to local law enforcement, the Mississippi Attorney General's Medicaid Fraud Unit, and the Mississippi Department of Health. Reports of long-term care resident abuse can also be made to Adult Protective Services, to their Vulnerable Person Abuse Hotline, or the Long-Term Care Ombudsman in the Division of Aging and Adult Services. The Long-Term Care Ombudsmen are authorized by the Older Americans Act, and they work with residents in long-term care facilities. The state long-term care ombudsman provides services that protect the health, safety, welfare, and rights of residents through leadership, oversight, and monitoring.